And joining us now, Donald Savoie from the Université de Moncton and the author of Power, Where Is It? It's good to have you back here at TVO.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
I want to start with a great quote that I plucked out of your book because it's a book that examines where power is located and how it's changed over the years. And there's the quote: "Politics is about wanting power, getting it, exercising it, and keeping it." Jean Chrétien said that. Who'd know better than him, back-to-back majority governments? Do you agree? Has he put his finger on it?
Oh, he's a master of politics and he's a master of power and where is it and how to grab it and manage it. So there's no question that he was right.
Why is it important, as far as you're concerned, to know where power is?
Well, it's a fundamental tenet of our system. If you live in a democratic state, it's important for voters, citizens, to know who has power. And I set out to establish if we had seen some changes in recent years, and I think we have. And I wanted to point out to interested voters and interested citizens, here's where power may lie. It's not where you might think it does, and it's not where it was 30 years ago.
Before we examine that, is it a given that if you've got more power, I necessarily have less? It's a zero-sum game?
Somewhat, because power does shift. And we've seen it over the past 20 years and so on. So if somebody loses power, chances are somebody else is going to gain it.
You tell us that it's now more difficult than ever to locate where it is. Why is that?
All kinds of reasons, but essentially we've muddled organizations so much that we've made it virtually impossible for an organization to take an objective and run with it. And so we've created so many different zones of power.
Now when you say we, who do you mean?
We the system, we Canadians, we Parliament, we the officers of Parliament.
Well, hang on, you didn't do it and I didn't do it, so who's the we?
Well, I think we might have, I think citizens applied pressure to have more transparency in government, to have greater accountability in government, and we've added layers of accountability, layers of transparency, and we made it very difficult for government department, a line department, to get things done. And so we've created what I would call loose power, and loose power belongs to only a few people. It can't belong to any organization. And who's in a position to grab that loose power and run with it? It used to be a government department, less so now.
Do these things just happen, or are they kind of willfully done? Because, when the system's so big, sometimes it just, by inertia or whatever, things happen.
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I think it just happened, and I think we've overlaid so many processes and so many government decision-making processes that it's very difficult to grab something and run with it. If you want to grab something, you'll probably be grabbing smoke, and you're not going to grab, real, unless you are in a position to grab whatever loose power is around and run with it. And that happens to be the Prime Minister and his courtiers and so on.
I think most people who follow this stuff well remember Pierre Trudeau's view of members of Parliament when they were 100 feet or 100 yards or whatever it was he said away from Parliament Hill. He called them a bunch of nobodies. But let us, so the lessening power of the member of Parliament is something that has been tracked for several decades now. But here's one of the quotes from your book: "If one is looking to locate influence, let alone power, one needs to look elsewhere than to MPs or parliamentary committees." Can you help us, just take us through a bit of the history here, tracing the waning influence of the Member of Parliament? When did it start? Where are we now?
I think the critical moment was probably late 60s, when we changed the process to table budget estimates, where we struck a deal, not you and I, but somebody struck a deal.
Well, it's Pierre Trudeau. If it's late 60s, you're talking Trudeau.
Trudeau and Mandarins and so on. I think they struck a deal because they wanted to get to simplify the process and get the estimates through. So they struck a deal. If it's not approved by a certain date, it is deemed to have been approved. In exchange for that, they gave MPs a bigger budget, bigger offices, more staff. But they lost the capacity to go after the spending estimates. And I think if you can't go after the spending estimates, if you can't go after how government spends and where, you lose a big chunk of any influence that you might have. So I think the critical moment was there, but then we've gone on and on and on. And now at the moment, I think political parties have lost their soul. I think political parties don't stand for much. They hug the center, and we've transformed parties into the personality of the leader.
Well, you said they're election machines, basically. You crank them up around election time, they raise money, and that's it.
That's it.
Huh.
Yeah.
But if we look at that grand bargain that was made back in the late 1960s, if members of Parliament got bigger office staffs and more resources, bigger budgets, presumably that has allowed them, in exchange for giving up an oversight role over Parliament, to take care of their constituents better. So has that been the trade-off?
Well, I think the trade-off, rather than use staff and resources to look at the spending estimates, to look at government policies, to look at programs. They've used the staff and resources to play partisan politics. And there's, there's a deep price to pay. I think that's where, had they made use of those, those resources to grab whatever government is doing and look at it and assess it, they would have been much further ahead. There's a story in here that the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee challenged public servants to say, you put a blank piece of paper in the estimates and see if anybody's going to notice. And I think he was right. Nobody would ever notice.
Because they don't read them anymore.
They don't read them anymore. They don't look at it. No, they get volumes and volumes and volumes of papers and documents, and MPs don't look at it. And staff of MPs, A, it's a bit complicated because you need the background to really look at it, and B, they're much more keen on playing partisan politics, playing to the media back home, setting up all kinds of interviews and so on, rather than look at the fundamental spending patterns of government or fundamental policies.
But you look at last week's vote in the House of Commons on the gun registry issue. Now that's a pretty good example of where your average everyday member of parliament had a lot of power. So is it really fair to say that these folks kind of aren't relevant and have no power left anymore?
Well, when there's an issue that pops up, and when that issue doesn't deal with a government department or government processes, that it's a standalone kind of issue, like gun registry, yeah, MPs and parties and Canadians, do have a say. But when a question is caught into the process, into the policy-making process, decision-making process, it gets lost. And I don't think, again, I think that's when some member of parliament would, if they want to grab it, I think most of the time they would be grabbing smoke.
Let's make sure we understand our terms here. Power as different from influence. How would you make the distinction?
Well, power is somebody that has the ultimate power to make a decision. Influence is the person who influences the person who makes that decision. Gordon Robertson, the former clerk of the Privy Council, explained it quite well some 30 years ago. He said, public servants have influence, politicians have power.
But if you, by that definition, there's only one person in Ottawa then that has power, and that's the Prime Minister.
On matters that matter to him, yes. And everything else goes by osmosis. Everything else goes through a system. And you can go 2 or 3 years. You can put a process, you can put a program, you can put any question into the machinery of government, and it's going to go on and on and on for 2 or 3 years, and it doesn't come out. But if the Prime Minister grabs it and said, "That's my issue, I'm going to run with it," something is going to happen.
He's the ultimate authority.
He's the ultimate, and we're seeing a case now quite recently, the G8 spending boondoggle. I don't think the Prime Minister was fully aware. I don't think that the Minister of Finance was fully aware. The system grabbed it, ran with it, and made some silly decisions. Silly decisions. But had the Prime Minister been on top of that file, it wouldn't have happened.
Well, this raises an issue about concentration in the Prime Minister's office, which, as we all know, has been increasing over the last 3 or 4 decades. Tell me this, why would any Prime Minister want to increasingly concentrate all the power in his or her office, knowing that that means that if something goes wrong, you really have nobody else to blame but yourself for it?
Well, I think it's a matter of trusting your staff more than trusting your cabinet ministers. There's a famous story, quite a well-known story that happened 30, 40 years ago. A minister went in to see Pierre Trudeau and said, "Look, I have a deputy minister. It's not working out. He's not very competent." And the Prime Minister looked at him and said, "I know that deputy minister. He's more competent than you."
Oof.
So that was...
Who was the minister?
Well, I'm not in the position to say.
Can't blame a guy for asking.
Good for you. So I think we've reached a point where access to information, transparency, officers of Parliament, overlaid with so many things. There's so many things that can go wrong that the Prime Minister thinks that if he concentrates influence in his office and makes the key decisions, that there's less of a chance that things are really going to go wrong.
And what do you think the implications of that trend have been now?
Well, enormous. I teach a graduate program, and we were talking last week. Name me a few cabinet ministers. My students, second-year masters, said, Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister. After that, it's just, tough slugging. 20 years ago, I would have asked the same students, name a few minutes. They would have rattled off 10 or 20. The Romeo LeBlanc, the Alan McKechen, the Don Jameson. These people had personalities, influence. Less so now.
But again, if at the end of the day, it's all about serving Canadians best, does this do it better than the old way?
I don't think so. I don't think so, Steve. I think we need to get a better handle, and Canadians need to get a better handle on how the system works. I think we need to rebuild parties so they mean something. When you look at voter turnout and something is drifting down, when you look at cynicism that's really out there with politicians, bunch of crooks, bunch of this, bunch of that, that's not good. We need a system that that works. And I think Canadians have to have some confidence in the ability of their members of Parliament to connect their concerns to Parliament and through that inside government.
Agreed, but what's the average Canadian to do about that?
Well, I think they need to get involved. I would urge the average Canadian to become a member of a political party, whatever party that they may want it to be, and then push that party to make some strong policy stance. That would be one solution. We got to rebuild. I think democracy starts with parties. And if we have political parties that have no soul, only exist at the beck and call of the leader, something is wrong here.
At the risk of using an American metaphor, you want to have a tea party up here?
Well, I'm not sure it would work. It certainly wouldn't work back home.
Down east, you're saying?
No, I don't think it would have much of a chance there. No.
Okay. We've talked about the political side of the equation. Let's move over to the civil service side of things. Relatively speaking, how much more or less powerful today is the public service than it was a couple of generations ago?
Much less powerful.
Why has that happened?
Well, again, there's several reasons, but there was a time when if you went to Ottawa as a young public servant, there were some key departments: finance, foreign affairs, external affairs, Department of Industry. It doesn't happen anymore. I mean, I think every department looks alike. And so if you want to have some influence, you join the Privy Council office, which is at the center of government. I think that politicians started to believe 30 years ago in the yes minister syndrome, that bureaucrats had too much power. And I think they've done everything in their power to grab that influence and grab that power and bring it up. And so I think the morale problem that we know exists in the federal public service is real. I don't think it has anything to do with pay, pension, not at all. I think it has a lot to do with the inability of public servants to grab their work and own it. They don't own anything. When you reach a point where you tell StatsCan, which 5,000 people, professionals, so on, we know better than you. If you need a long questionnaire, we know better. I think you reach the point where do you draw the line? How do you trust a deputy minister to make key decisions? There's an old theory that you separate policy and management, that politicians deal with policy, but where's management? I think it's all right for the Prime Minister and Minister to say, we want a census. But once you've established that and once you've funded that, I think you need to have trust in the public servants that they can make the key decisions to run a census fairly well. You don't need to micromanage that. I think we've turned senior public servants into short order cooks rather than sous chef.
But again, if you want to get back to trust, and you mentioned the terrific British series Yes Minister a minute ago, that what made that show funny was that the politicians were all a bunch of idiots and the civil servants were very clever, knew where the bodies were buried, knew how to get stuff done, and more importantly, knew how to stop stuff. Isn't that the nub of the problem there, is that politicians get into office with an agenda to get things done and they think that the civil service is just thwarting their every will?
I think it was much more the case 30 years ago and now. I think a Prime Minister that wants certain things done, I think a Prime Minister that wants to kill a long questionnaire in a census or kill an office somewhere in a constituency somewhere in Canada.
He didn't want to kill the questionnaire. He wanted to kill the notion of people going to jail to fill it out, just for the record.
Well, okay, we can debate that. But I think the point is we've turned senior public servants into people serving influence, serving advice that they think the ministers will want to hear.
Here's a graphic we're going to call Power Breakfast. And again, another quote from your book, Power, Where Is It? I asked a deputy minister in Ottawa to help me locate where power currently lies inside government. Her answer, actually, you can find it most mornings when the clerk and the Prime Minister meet. For those who are not familiar with the insides and the guts of government, explain the significance of that quote.
Well, the clerk of the Privy Council wears three hats. He's head of the public service, he's deputy minister to the Prime Minister, and he's secretary to the cabinet. The real powerful part of that equation is deputy minister to the Prime Minister. So when they meet every morning or every second morning, he comes to the Prime Minister with his own agenda. He has several things that he wants the PM to sign off on. The Prime Minister has 3 or 4 things that he wants to get done. So they meet, and it's like a bargaining process, and the key decisions happen there.
Okay, but one guy works technically for the other guy.
Yeah.
So why would, let's use the current examples, why would Stephen Harper need to make a deal with his deputy minister to get stuff done? Why can't he just say to him, I want this, do it?
Oh, it's part of the process. If the clerk of the Privy Council goes to see the Prime Minister and said, this DM appointment is very important, I think the system needs this DM appointment.
Deputy minister.
Yeah, sorry. And the Prime Minister will say, okay, fine, that doesn't bother me, whoever he or she is, if it makes the system happy, fine. But I need somebody appointed as ambassador to somewhere. There's a trading process there. And it happens there, and it happens in closed door, and that's where power, a lot of the power, actually happens.
But again, why would the Prime Minister need to make a bargain with his deputy to get an ambassador appointed? He's the Prime Minister. He has that right.
Sure, but there's a big system. 250,000 people work in that big system. They report to the Clerk of the Privy Council, all of them. They don't report to the Prime Minister. The Clerk reports to the Prime Minister. And that's a massive system. You don't want to take it on lightly. You take it on when it matters. And when the system says it wants certain things done, I think Prime Minister, most Prime Ministers said, yeah, go.
So have you found in your research that Prime Ministers fear the potential of a civil service uprising against them? The potential to thwart their will, is that strong?
I wouldn't use the word fear, but I would say that all Prime Ministers would worry if there's a brown envelope going up to you or the journalists or so on, because leaks can hurt a government, and we've seen it. And so it's a process that has to be managed.
One of the things we have seen in the last probably 10, 15 years is this notion of the public service being urged to act more like the private sector. We see incentives, pay incentives. You'll make more money as a deputy minister if you can make certain things happen that ministers want. The notion that the people you work for are clients as opposed to citizens. What's your view on this trend?
It's been a disaster.
You don't like it, eh?
No, I don't
How come?
like it, because it doesn't work. And I deal with it in the book. You can't show me one jurisdiction anywhere where pay for performance has worked. How do you establish the performance of a deputy minister? How do you do that?
You set certain benchmarks, and if they're reached, then you get an extra bonus.
But there's all kinds of reasons why it may or may not happen. There's all kinds of reasons: political, the media, budget, series of consideration, lack of resources. There's all kinds of issues. We've tried this pay for performance in Britain, in the US, Canada, Australia, and so on. I know of no jurisdiction that's got it right. It's very difficult because there's so many factors at play. If you tell a salesman in the private sector, you go out and sell 1,000 fridges. At the end of the day, you know if he or she has sold 1,000 fridges. If you tell a public servant, I need this to happen, we need to cut by 10%, clients have to be satisfied by 5%, there's so many factors at play, there's so many forces at play. How can you isolate that the reason why you've attained those objectives or not is the work of a deputy minister?
Well, humor me here for a second. I'll just give you, for instance, and I have no idea if the deputy minister in question has been incentivized or incented, whatever the right word is, to do this. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years in the province of Ontario, the government, in its wisdom, decided that people needed more hip replacements and knee operations and that kind of thing, and the system wasn't set up for it. So the Deputy Minister of Health, presumably at some point, had to re-engineer the system to do less of that and more of this. And they've got websites that show that in fact happened. The hips and knees are way, way up, and the other stuff is, not as much a priority, it's down. Could you not come to the conclusion that obviously the deputy did something right to make this happen, and therefore he or she is entitled to a bonus?
Well, there's certain quantifiable things that you can look at. That may well be one of them. But I would suggest that there's all kinds of factors that went into play there. That deputy got more resources, and on and on and on. I think the fundamental point here is that the public sector is unlike the private sector in many ways. The private sector is unlike the public sector in many ways.
Sure.
The two shall never meet. And when we try to meet them, it's very simplistic, and it creates all kinds of problems. I think it creates the kind of morale problem. I think a person who joins the public service has a certain, sounds old-fashioned, a vocation in mind. It's different. The public sector is not like the private sector.
It's a calling.
It's somewhat of a calling. Now, I think it's in trouble. I think the calling is in trouble. I think there is a morale problem. I think they're searching for a proper role. I think they're searching for where they fit in the scheme of things. I think they feel that they're not valued by Canadians as much as might have been the case 30 years ago. So there are some serious issues, but the public sector is not like the private sector.
And therefore this desire, I think, that probably most Canadians who either run a business or work in the private sector and who would like to see some of those private sector principles, let's not get too carried away here, but how about like efficiency? Is that okay to bring to bear to the job?
Well, there's different ways of doing it. I mean, Margaret Thatcher said, I'll bring efficiencies by cutting. He said, you cut 150,000 positions in the civil service. Once you've done that, you're going to be far more efficient. There's one way of doing it. There's another way is to gerrymander the whole system so that it looks like the private sector. I don't think the latter has worked.
Let me get you to comment on another one of the quotes in your book, and this was from a recently retired deputy minister who compared the way it is today to the way it was 35 years ago when he first joined. And he said, I saw economic nationalism actually die in Canada while serving in the public service. With economic nationalism came instruments that the federal government had in its policy and regulatory arsenal, which gave it an ability to exert control over the business world, particularly foreign businesses. In that sense, the government had more power over the private sector back then than it has now. And again, I'd like your view on whether or not this transition or this change that he has seen has been to the benefit or the detriment of the Canadian public.
Oh, I think there's been a great deal of benefit. I think if you let the private sector, if you unleash it and get the kind of dynamic elements that it can produce, I think you get a lot of benefits. But it makes a second point, and the point is, if you dislocate power, you give it to the courts like we've done under the Charter. If you give it to officers of Parliament, if you give it to G8, if you dislocate power, if you move it around, there's less loose power. And if there's less loose power, the one who sits at the top of that loose power, i.e. the Prime Minister, says, let's grab whatever loose power there is, because there's not as much as there was been 30, 40 years ago. There's all kinds of issues that are settled outside of the politics, outside of Parliament, outside of Cabinet, whether it's in the courts, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in international trade agreements. So power is flowed up and down and out. So there's less loose power, and that's where the Prime Minister, I think, has made up his mind, look, there's not enough to really go around, I'm going to grab it and run with it.
Let me follow up on one of the things you said there, because we now have a situation in Canada, I think unlike 25 or 50 years ago, where whatever power members of Parliament had or credibility they had to hold the government to account or to provide an oversight function, you tell us is gone. That we've got a parliamentary budget officer, we've got an auditor general, we've got, I don't know, 9, 10, 11 of these kind of...
13.
13, is it?
Depending how you count, yeah.
These kinds of, what do you want to call them? Watchdogs or...
Officers of Parliament.
Officers of Parliament. Power has moved to them now, hasn't it, in a significant way?
Influences.
Influence, not power, though.
Yeah. The oversight, I think they have much more influence. I think the media turns to them. I think political parties have said, we can't hold this ground accountable. Let's give the steering wheel over to these officers of Parliament. And they're the ones, the Auditor General has become a media star. That's not what she ought to be, but that's what it's become. We've created officers of Parliament to overview virtually every sector.
She's become a media star because, for whatever reason, the media has reported on what she's done, and the public, in their wisdom, have decided that she's more trustworthy than some of the other folks in there. That's fair, isn't it?
That's fair, but it's also sad. When Parliament, when the opposition cannot hold a government to account, when the opposition takes the steering wheel over and turns it over to officers of Parliament, say, you drive, because we can't drive this thing, to me it's sad. The function of Parliament is being eroded somehow, and they need to recapture that.
But Sheila Fraser, I mean, she's not, I've got to say this carefully here, I mean, the public's pretty good about judging BS, right? And they've determined that she's a pretty authentic, not a showboat, not a show-off, not a headline grabber, that she puts her head down and does her job well, which is why people trust her. I mean, and she's earned that, hasn't she? Sure,
and I don't want to take her on. That's not the point here. The point is, she's got a different function. How can she get it wrong? She goes to war and counts the dead bodies. She doesn't fight in the war. I mean, there's a big difference. So if you go after the fact and you look at how, you can always find flaws, always find something wrong, and the public will eat it up. But at the end of the day, she's not running programs, she's not delivering policies. She's oversight. It's an oversight body, and sure, it gains brownie points in terms of Canadians.
Okay, in our last minute here then, I want you to, after this exhaustive survey that you've done, all the research that you've done, you've now seen where power was, how it's moved, how it's mutated. Do you think at the end of the day Canadians are better off or worse off given how power has changed?
Worse off.
Worse off.
Yeah, worse off. And I think the average Canadian, certainly. Because there was a time when institutions, you knew you'd go to an institution, you know to go to a government department, cabinet, Parliament, you could figure out where influence and power was. At the moment, it's all over the place. And only the well-heeled, with the resources to hire lobbyists, can figure it out and go to where power may, and because power lies in the hands of key people now. It doesn't lie in the hand of departments or processes. It lies in the hands of several key people. And if you're well-heeled, you go to them and you get things done. But if you're an average Joe and you look to Parliament to hold, to get things done or to gain answers, it's not going to happen. It's not happening anymore.
Isn't it? I don't know. You know this way better than I do. But if
you're
the average Joe in Canada, you never had any power, right? That hasn't changed.
Oh, I think if you were the average Joe 40 years ago, you could go to your member of Parliament and you weren't grabbing smoke. I think the member of Parliament was much more connected. I think you could go to a cabinet minister from my neck of the woods. You could go to Romeo LeBlanc, to Nell and Jimmy Kekin, and here I can think of several, and you could get some answers. The average Joe could go in that riding and talk to his member of Parliament. Say, can you talk to that minister and get some answers? I think it was much, much easier because departments had the influence, the power, and the programs.
Okay, let me try going back at you one more time on that. The average Joe, you know, I've talked to a lot of politicians too, and what do they, you know, what do they want from, what do constituents want from their MPs? They want their workers' compensation claim. They want help with that. They want some help with a visa. They want some help with a passport. They want some help getting my, you know, my aunt, my uncle from overseas in here as landed immigrants or whatever. Members of Parliament can still do that. There's nothing about the way powers change that would prevent them from still doing that, is there?
Well, it's much more difficult. It's much more complicated. But I think Parliament is more than that. I think a member of Parliament is more than that. I mean, what connects Canadians from British Columbia to St. John's? What connects Canadians? It's Parliament. What makes me relate to you? It's Parliament. It's our political institutions. That's what connects Canadians. It's not an idea. There's got to be an institution that brings it all together, and that's Parliament. So it's more than EI. It's being the voice of Canadians somewhere that needs to be heard. That's Parliament. We've lost it.
Professor Savoie, we're always grateful for your visits to us here in Upper Canada. Do visit us again. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me.